Naomi Ellison, a 42-year-old black woman, was simply waiting outside the courthouse to pick up her younger brother. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't break any laws. But a white police officer saw her presence as a threat and handcuffed her in front of everyone. Moments later, a Pentagon ID slipped from her bag, and the truth hit harder than anyone expected. Why would a black federal officer let herself be arrested without a word? If this story stirs something in you, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's go back to the exact moment it all began. It was just past 9 on a Thursday morning when Naomi Ellison settled onto the cold concrete bench outside the Fulton County Courthouse. She didn't shift much, didn't check her phone, didn't pace like most people waiting nervously for something inside those stone walls. She just sat there, still with her hoodie pulled over her braids, her shoulders straight, and her eyes watching the courthouse door like a soldier waiting for the next command. She wasn't in uniform and she wasn't making a scene. She wasn't doing anything at all, really, just waiting, watching, breathing slowly like someone who had learned through experience, not lecture, that stillness could sometimes be the most powerful move in the room. People passed her without acknowledgement. Some clutched their bags tighter. One white woman older, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that didn't match. The southern heat slowed her steps, frowned and muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Always loitering around our buildings. No shame at all. The woman didn't stop. She didn't even look Naomi in the eye. She just kept walking like the words she dropped were as natural and expected as the leaves blowing across the sidewalk. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't turn her head, not even her lips twitched. She had heard worse in her time in places far more dangerous than this sidewalk in Georgia. Words didn't pierce her like they used to. Not after Fallujah. Not after what happened in Kandahar. What hurt now wasn't what they called her, it was how easy it still was for them to say it. She blinked slowly, her gaze returning to the courthouse entrance. She wasn't here for herself. She was here for her brother, Micah. 25, smart, passionate, angry, in the way young black men had every right to be. He had been arrested during a protest outside a campus building 2 weeks ago. Something about disorderly conduct. Nothing violent, nothing threatening. Just loud words, a cardboard sign, and too much truth for some folks to stomach. The court hearing was short. It always was for people they didn't plan to listen to. Naomi had dropped him off that morning and promised to be waiting right here when he walked out. He didn't know she hadn't left. Didn't know she had remained here unmoving like a silent witness in a trial nobody asked her to attend. Her fingers lightly tapped the strap of her worn canvas bag resting beside her on the bench. Inside, tucked in a leather case behind her reading glasses and a wrapped protein bar, was her Pentagon ID. Not expired. Not ceremonial. Still active. Still valid. The kind of badge that turned security lines into handshakes. The kind that made generals nod and gatekeepers step aside. But out here today, it was just plastic and print hidden beneath a quiet woman in gray sneakers and a hoodie that had seen better days. She hadn't planned to show it. She almost never did. It wasn't pride that kept her from flashing it. It was principle. She didn't need the world to respect her because of where she worked. She wanted it to respect her because she was human, because she had earned it long before she ever walked into a war room. A soft gust of wind tugged at her collar. Somewhere across the street, a traffic light blinked red over empty lanes. Naomi shifted slightly, adjusting her weight. She glanced once more at the courthouse steps, then let her eyes close just for a moment. And in that quiet, her mind wandered uninvited to a morning 15 years earlier. She had stood in a very different lobby, arms crossed tight across her chest, watching a much younger Micah sit behind plexiglass, bruised and trembling after a run-in with local cops over a mistaken identity. He had been 17, too scared to be angry, too angry to speak. Naomi hadn't cried that day. She had waited while they processed, signed, released, then walked her baby brother out of that station with the same silence she wore today. Back in the present, her jaw clenched slightly. Not from anger, from remembering, from the dull ache of understanding exactly how long some things refused to change. Naomi opened her eyes again, her expression unreadable. She was still watching that courthouse door. Not a single muscle in her body moved without purpose. She couldn't know that in less than 10 minutes, her world would be interrupted by a man with a badge, a bias, and a bruised sense of control, and that everything she had chosen not to reveal about herself would soon be forced into the open right there in front of the same courthouse that was supposed to represent justice. She only knew this: she was there to take her brother home. And until he stepped through that door, she wasn't going anywhere. He stepped out of the patrol car like he'd done it 100 times before, calm, calculated, and convinced he was in the right. Officer Blake Carson, a white man in his mid-30s, had the kind of walk that made people straighten their backs or cross the street without thinking. He scanned the sidewalk in front of the courthouse, his eyes landing squarely on the black woman sitting alone in a hoodie, her posture too steady for his liking. Naomi Ellison didn't move. She sat just as she had for the past 40 minutes, quiet, composed, watching the courthouse doors like they held the only thing she cared about. But she felt his eyes before he spoke. It wasn't curiosity. It was something colder, more familiar. Like he was looking for a box to put her in and hoping it had a label that matched his suspicion. Blake took 2 slow steps toward her and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said loud enough for others nearby to hear. "What's your business here today?" Naomi turned her head calmly, almost politely. "I'm waiting for my brother," she said. "He's inside." Blake tilted his head slightly. "You got ID on you?" "I do." "Let me see it." "I'd rather not." "There's no issue here." His tone shifted. "This is a federal building. You can't just hang around. You're loitering." Naomi blinked once. "I'm sitting. That's all. There's nothing illegal about that, is there?" The pause that followed said everything. He didn't like the way she said it, not the words, but the way she said them. Calm, composed, not scared, not submissive. It was enough to push him further. "You don't get to dictate tone," he snapped. "Stand up. Show me your bag." From a few feet away, Officer Jenna Marks stood watching. She was younger, also white, clearly newer to the force. Her stance lacked the rigidity of Blake's. There was hesitation in her shoulders, something unspoken tightening in her brow. Naomi didn't stand. Her voice remained level. "Unless I'm being detained or charged with something, I believe I have the right to stay seated." Blake took a step closer. "That's it. On your feet." Jenna shifted. "Blake, maybe we just..." But he cut her off with a glance sharp and quick. Loitering with suspicion, failure to comply. Naomi rose slowly, not out of fear, not in surrender. It was something else. A choice. Her movements were calm and deliberate, like she'd rehearsed them in another life, in another kind of uniform. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She simply turned and placed her hands behind her back. The cuffs clicked shut. The moment passed in a hush. Even the courthouse steps seemed to go quiet. A few heads turned. One man frowned but kept walking. A young woman hesitated with her phone in hand, thumb hovering over the record button, but she lowered it. Naomi stood there, wrists bound, eyes forward. Jenna stayed rooted in place, her hand hovering near her holster, not out of threat, but out of uncertainty. She watched as Blake took hold of Naomi's arm and led her away from the bench. There was a strange tension in the air, like the silence around them was holding its breath. Naomi didn't say a word. Not as Blake asked again what was in her bag. Not as he lifted it from the bench with a tug that jostled the zipper. She walked with him, chin level, spine unbent. The bag dangled in his hand, swinging gently with each step. And somewhere in that movement, the zipper loosened. No one noticed. Not Jenna, not Blake. Not the man on the phone across the street or the security guard watching through tinted glass. The bag wobbled, shifted, whispered its own quiet warning. But Naomi noticed. She always noticed. Still, she said nothing. Blake glanced sideways at her, maybe looking for anger, maybe expecting her to shout or break or argue. But all he got was stillness. A silence so complete it became a presence of its own. "She thinks she's better than this," he muttered mostly to himself, but loud enough for Jenna to hear. Naomi turned her head slightly, not to argue, not even to answer. Just enough to say something without raising her voice. "I've answered more dangerous questions in languages you don't speak," she said softly. "You'll forgive me if I don't feel the need to explain myself today." Blake didn't respond. He just tightened his grip and kept moving. Jenna didn't speak either, but her eyes, for the first time, didn't follow Blake. They stayed on Naomi, and the bag in his hand, still swinging, still open, still holding something no one in that moment was prepared to see. But it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. Not with gravity, not with time, not with truth. They hadn't even reached the patrol car when it happened. Naomi's feet moved steady over the courthouse steps, Blake still gripping her arm like she might bolt, even though her body gave no signal of resistance. Her canvas bag dangled from his other hand, loose and awkward in his grip. The zipper, already halfway undone, caught on the edge of a stair, jostled again, and then, without warning, a small rectangular object slid out and hit the stone with a soft but unmistakable thud. It didn't bounce. It landed flat. A few people turned at the sound just as the light caught the surface of the card. It was laminated edged in dark navy blue with a gold eagle insignia at the top that glinted briefly before going still. A girl standing near the base of the courthouse steps froze. She had been filming a TikTok dance with her phone propped up on a planter. Layla Thomas, 14. Black, bright-eyed earbuds in, had started recording just as the arrest began. Her dance had long stopped, but she hadn't hit pause. Her phone was still rolling when the card fell. She zoomed in now, slowly, her young mind catching on the words printed across the badge. Department of Defense, Level 4, Security Clearance, Authorized Access Pentagon Operations. Officer Jenna Marks saw it too. She moved quickly, breaking her stillness for the first time since the cuffs had come out. She bent to pick up the ID before Blake could react. Her fingers trembled. "Sir..." Her voice cracked as she turned the badge over in her palm, staring at Naomi's photo printed beneath the federal seal. "This is a DOD Level 4 ID. Blake turned his head, the confidence in his jawline faltering just a fraction. "Anyone can make a fake," he said. But the words came too fast, like they were shielding him more than they were challenging the truth. His eyes didn't meet Jenna's. They stayed on the ID, calculating as if willing it to disappear would somehow undo the moment. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't say a word. She turned her head slowly, gaze locking not on Blake or Jenna, but directly into Layla's camera. The girl, breath held, didn't look away. Her hand steadied the phone, recording every inch of the moment, now thick with confusion, with contradiction, with something no one had prepared for. There was a beat of silence where time didn't move. Then Naomi's voice cut through, not loud, not angry, just low and sure and certain. "The truth doesn't need to scream," she said. "It just needs to fall in the right place." The crowd shifted. People who had previously walked by without notice had now stopped completely. Whispers passed from stranger to stranger, rippling outward like a pebble dropped in still water. "Did she say Pentagon? Is that real? She has a military clearance. She didn't even say a word when they cuffed her." Blake's grip tightened on Naomi's arm, though now it felt less like control and more like anchoring himself to a story that was slipping fast out of his grasp. His eyes flicked to Jenna, but she didn't speak. She just stood there, still holding the ID with both hands like it was heavier than it looked. Naomi stood still. The metal cuffs reflected sunlight, but she didn't squirm, didn't pull. If anything, she stood taller now, like the weight of the moment had straightened her spine rather than bent it. Layla stepped forward, slightly emboldened by the hush around her. "Ma'am," she said, almost a whisper. "Are you? Like, really in the Pentagon?" Naomi glanced down at her, then gave the smallest nod. Not for show, not for applause. Just confirmation. Quiet. Grounded. Real. Jenna finally spoke again, her voice barely above a breath. "Sir, we need to let her go. Now." Blake didn't answer. He just stared at the badge still resting in Jenna's hand, then back at Naomi. You could see it on his face, the internal math, the rewriting of assumptions, the collision between power and reality. He'd arrested a woman he thought he could control, dismiss, maybe intimidate. And now he was staring at a symbol of authority he didn't understand, issued by an agency that wouldn't answer his calls. Naomi turned slightly toward him, the first motion she'd made in his direction since being cuffed. "You want to control the narrative you never bothered to read?" she said softly. "But some stories write themselves." And then she turned back to the steps, to Layla, to the growing crowd, who had now stopped pretending not to see. A few more phones were raised. A few more voices murmured. Jenna finally moved to unlock the cuffs. Her hands were still shaking. I didn't know, she whispered, almost apologetic. Naomi didn't nod, didn't absolve, just looked her in the eye and said, "But you felt something." That was enough to ask. The cuffs dropped. The sound echoed like punctuation. Blake took a step back. Not because someone told him to, but because there was nothing else left to do. Naomi rubbed her wrists once slowly. She bent down, picked up her bag, and slid the ID back inside. Then she stood just as calmly as she had when the morning began and looked out over the small circle of strangers, now witnessing more than they bargained for. And then finally she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I came here for my brother," she said. "But maybe I needed to be here for something else too." It wasn't a speech, it wasn't a headline, it was a reminder, and it had just begun. The courthouse doors creaked open with the soft groan of old wood and older justice. Out walked Micah Ellison, 24. Black, thin-framed, with anxious eyes and shoulders that had learned to stay low since he was 17. He blinked at the sun, rubbing the stiffness from a morning of courtroom benches and waiting rooms. He never expected what he saw next. At the base of the steps there was a circle, small but tightening, of people with phones out, faces pinched in shock, curiosity, or shame. In the center of it, standing calm and impossibly still, was his sister, Naomi. Micah froze halfway down the stairs, his mouth parting in confusion, then horror. The cuffs, her posture, the way the white officer stood half a step back, unsure now. "What the hell?" he muttered, then stumbled down the last few steps. "Naomi!" he shouted, voice cracking. "What are they doing to you?" People turned. Some recognized him from the court minutes earlier, still wearing the same wrinkled polo shirt he'd worn for his hearing. A few murmured. One woman tried to hold him back gently, but Micah pushed past. He'd barely taken 3 steps toward her before an officer, not Blake but another nearby, raised a hand and pressed it against Micah's chest. "Sir, you need to step back." Micah's voice broke again. "She didn't do anything. That's my sister." His eyes locked on Naomi's. Those same eyes that had come for him when he was 17, trembling in a precinct lobby, waiting to be released. The same eyes that had sat through his first community hearing and every visit after. Now those eyes met his again, but this time they weren't scared. They were anchored, unshaken. "Naomi," he choked. Why aren't you fighting this?" Naomi's hands were free now, but she hadn't moved much. She looked at Micah the way only an older sister could, equal parts fierce and full of grief, as if watching a storm she had tried her whole life to shelter him from. And then she spoke, quiet but clear. "Don't," she said as a murmur passed through the crowd. "This time, let the weight fall on them." Micah's mouth opened again, but no words came. His shoulders shook and his eyes welled. He looked around at the badge still in Jenna's trembling hands, at Blake avoiding eye contact, at the bystanders who had stopped pretending not to see. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't rush to speak. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply cried. A tear traced his cheek as another officer gently moved him back toward the sidewalk. Behind him, a voice rose, soft at first, then louder, from a man with a newsboy cap and a weathered face, white, maybe in his 70s. "This woman," he said, pointing at Naomi, "isn't who they think she is." People turned. She stood there, didn't say a word. They cuffed her like she was some threat. "But I've worked federal security. That badge isn't a fake." He looked straight at Officer Blake. "You just arrested someone with clearance higher than your entire department." Blake stiffened. Jenna looked down. Micah wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. Naomi didn't respond to any of it. She didn't need to, because for once the story wasn't being rewritten by a defense attorney or a headline. It was unfolding in real time in front of too many witnesses and too many rolling cameras to be buried. And in that moment, with Micah watching, and the weight of her silence pressing louder than any accusation, Naomi did something few people noticed. She reached out gently, touched her brother's shoulder, and let her fingers rest there just enough to say, "I'm here. You're safe. For now." Micah nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the same kind of story he'd grown up seeing. Not this time. Courtroom 3B wasn't built for justice. It was built for order. Clean wood panels, harsh white lights, and a silence that pressed down like a gavel waiting to fall. Naomi stood in the middle of it, wrists no longer bound, but every eye around her still treating her as if they were. Officer Blake Carson walked 2 steps behind her, trying to regain the weight in his stride. He carried himself like the room belonged to him, even though the ripple in his confidence hadn't quite faded. Officer Jenna Marks entered quietly after them, her posture, rigid jaw set, and fingers still twitching slightly from the moment outside. At the bench sat Judge Richard Granger, late 60s, white, a reputation for order, efficiency, and very little tolerance for gray areas. His face, lined but cold, barely moved as he flipped through the preliminary papers on his desk. He looked up briefly, eyes scanning Naomi, then down again. Disturbance, unknown suspect. Refusal to comply, he read aloud, each word clipped mechanical. We've seen this before. No one corrected him. Blake cleared his throat. Your Honor, this woman was seated outside the courthouse without a visible purpose. When questioned, she refused to identify herself. Her bag contained what appears to be falsified federal identification. I suspect she may be impersonating government personnel. Jenna's head turned slightly. Just slightly. But the look she gave him was sharp enough to cut marble. She said nothing. Not yet. Naomi stood still. Her hands were at her sides. She wore no expression, not defiance, not fear, not submission. Just presence. She had entered 1,000 rooms like this before. Rooms where people spoke of rules but never of truth. Granger barely glanced at her again. Is there any documentation of her attempting to resist or flee? No, sir. Blake replied quickly, but she was non-compliant and evasive. The judge nodded as if that were proof enough. The court is within its rights to hold a subject for further questioning under suspicion of identity fraud, unless the suspect wishes to speak on her own behalf. Naomi's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. I do. There was a pause. Even Granger looked up this time, slightly surprised, not by the words, but by the tone. Calm, controlled, unapologetic. State your name for the record, he said. Naomi Ellison, Department of Defense. ID number ending in 6724B. Pentagon clearance level 4. Blake scoffed audibly. That ID could be printed in someone's basement. Naomi turned her head toward him just for a moment. And yet, you carried it like it weighed nothing. Granger rapped his gavel once more for form, then necessity. We will maintain order. He turned to Naomi again. You may present your statement. Naomi didn't step forward. She didn't need to. I was outside waiting for my brother who had a scheduled appearance on a minor disorderly conduct charge. I was seated, alone. I did not speak to anyone. I did not approach the courthouse door. I was not blocking access or impeding court operations. Officer Carson approached me. I responded respectfully. When I refused to open my bag without a warrant, I was detained. Not questioned, not searched legally. Detained. She paused long enough to let the words settle. Then she added without probable cause, my identity was questioned and dismissed, not because of what was in my bag, but because of the person holding it. No one moved. Even Judge Granger sat still, blinking slowly. Blake shifted behind Naomi, jaw tight. Jenna finally stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but it cut clear through the room. Your Honor. She said the ID was legitimate. I verified the seal myself. It was issued by the Department of Defense. Blake turned sharply. Jenna, but she didn't look at him. Granger tapped the paper in front of him. And yet, you brought her here. Officer Carson, with no resisting charge, no falsified documents confirmed, and no physical threat reported. Blake's voice lowered. I acted in caution. Naomi turned back toward the judge. Caution is not the same as bias. One protects people. The other targets them. Another pause, heavier this time. Jenna looked away, her throat tightening. She had walked into the courtroom as backup, but she knew in that moment what kind of backup she refused to be. Granger exhaled through his nose slowly. He folded the file closed and set it aside. This court will need time to review and verify identification. Until then, Ms. Ellison, you are to remain in the building, but are not currently under arrest. Naomi nodded once. That was enough, for now. Micah, watching through the doorway, exhaled for the first time in 10 minutes. Naomi didn't smile, but she knew the weight had started to shift. The courtroom was still, unnaturally still. No murmurs, no whispers, just that cold kind of silence that comes when people realize they've seen something they can't unsee. Naomi stood where they'd placed her. Not behind bars, not in cuffs, but surrounded by suspicion thick as glass. Judge Richard Granger adjusted his glasses with the kind of care reserved for people who need time to find the right reaction. His hand hovered over the case file, now thinner than the tension in the room. Blake stood beside him, not saying much, arms crossed, but you could feel him vibrating with the need to reclaim control. That control was slipping, fast. Naomi took a breath. She didn't raise her chin or square her shoulders like in some courtroom drama. She just moved. Quiet, calm, deliberate. Her hand reached beneath her sweater near the shoulder seam and slid out something she hadn't shown anyone before. It wasn't for effect. It wasn't a performance. It was protocol. A hard plastic government ID tethered to a secure lanyard emerged like a blade through fog. She held it out not in protest, not in pride, just in truth. This, she said, voice steady, was never in my bag. It never leaves my body. She stepped forward one controlled pace, then another. Not toward Blake, not toward the judge, but toward the court clerk who now looked like she'd been handed a live grenade. The clerk took it, walked it up, placed it in front of Granger. The seal caught the light, First Department of Defense Level 4. A clearance designation not handed out lightly. The type you didn't just flash to strangers. The type that meant in another room on another day, Naomi Ellison would have outranked every badge in this courtroom. Granger blinked, then blinked again. He traced the outline of the card with one finger, eyes narrowing as if trying to find the flaw, some edge lifted, some typo, anything. He found none. Officer Marks, he said, voice a half-tone lower. Jenna stepped forward. Already confirmed, Your Honor. I logged into the interagency database. It's real. She's listed under Active Duty Department of Defense. Embedded Analyst Special Strategic Operations Division. Clearance Level 4. She didn't look at Blake, but he flinched like she had shouted his name. Granger didn't move, just looked back at Naomi. And Naomi just stood there. The courtroom felt colder and heavier. Naomi's eyes didn't wander, but her mind did backward somewhere darker. The sharp memory wasn't invited. It never was. She saw herself younger. Helmet-tilted boots half covered in sand sweat and diesel stinging her nostrils. Iraq, 2011. A convoy ambush. She was holding Alyssa, her best friend, whose chest had stopped rising somewhere between the blast and the silence. Naomi had pressed her hands over the wound anyway, whispering into a stillness that had no echo. You don't forget what it costs to be the last one still breathing. Now, years later, she looked into the face of a courtroom judge who almost jailed her without a single confirmed fact. She didn't yell. She didn't ask for an apology. But when she spoke, her words cracked something open. You didn't arrest a woman, she said slowly. You arrested the years she spent fighting for you. The words didn't echo. They landed like stone dropped into water, clean, final, inescapable. Jenna looked down. Even she hadn't known who Naomi really was. Even she had hesitated at the badge, afraid of being the only one to say it out loud. But not anymore. Blake shifted his weight. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She could have said something sooner, he muttered. This whole thing could have been avoided if she hadn't been so damn... Naomi cut him off, gently but firmly. No, she said. You wanted silence because you thought it meant weakness. But silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes it's the last shield you have before someone mistakes your patience for permission. Judge Granger's hand twitched halfway toward his gavel, but he didn't strike it. His voice was quieter now. Why didn't you tell them, Ms. Ellison? Naomi looked at him, not with challenge, but with clarity. Because if I'd said it out there, it would have been dismissed as arrogance. If I'd said it in fear, it would have been spun as aggression. And if I'd screamed it, I'd still be in a holding cell. This way. She gestured gently to the courtroom. Everyone had a chance to show who they are. Micah, still standing in the hallway, had tears on his cheeks. He didn't try to wipe them anymore. He just watched his sister do what she had always done, stand between chaos and consequence. Jenna finally looked at Naomi, and for the first time her eyes weren't full of protocol. They were full of respect. Granger cleared his throat. The court recognizes Ms. Ellison as a federal officer with verified clearance. This hearing is suspended until further review of the incident's legality. He paused, then added more softly, You may remain seated. You are not under arrest. But Naomi didn't sit. She wasn't done yet. She turned her head just enough so Blake could hear her, only him. Imagine what happens, she said, when this footage reaches the Pentagon before your incident report does. Blake didn't reply. Couldn't. And that silence, it wasn't hers anymore. It was his. And it was just beginning. The silence in courtroom 3B hadn't broken, not truly. It hovered like dust in sunlight, clinging to every breath, every glance, every unread page in the file Judge Granger had stopped pretending to review. The air didn't shift until the door clicked open again. He didn't enter like a man in a rush. He didn't need to. Every step was measured, intentional. His suit gray-tailored, unwrinkled. His presence immediate, quiet, and unmistakably federal. Langston Reed. The badge on his chest read, Department of Defense. But it was his eyes, sharp, tired, unyielding, that told the real story. The kind of man called only when the system had stepped somewhere it shouldn't have and knew it. He didn't look at the spectators. Didn't acknowledge the bailiff. He walked straight to the bench, set a sealed folder on the judge's desk, and opened it with a single flip. Your Honor, he said calmly, we are submitting immediate request for full dismissal and release of Ms. Naomi Ellison. All charges are without standing. She is an active duty federal officer under Title 10, Section 806B, Department of Defense Intelligence Operations. The silence shifted, then heavier now. Even Jenna Marks, standing off to the side, dropped her pen mid-word. Blake Carson leaned back just slightly, like the floor had tilted under him. Judge Granger hesitated, then adjusted his glasses as if trying to stall the inevitable. He glanced at the folder, an official seal, a stamped signature. He didn't need to ask if it was real. Still, he cleared his throat carefully. This appears to be a misidentification, a breakdown in process. Langston didn't raise his voice. The process did not break. The perception did. And with that, he stepped back. All eyes returned to Naomi. She hadn't moved since the last word she'd spoken. She stood not defiant, not defensive, just steady, rooted. Then she spoke again, soft, unshaken. I made peace with bullets. She said, her voice quiet but unmistakably clear, but not with blind eyes. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a threat. It was an indictment, a truth that held up its own mirror and left it standing. Granger exhaled through his nose, slowly. No protest, no rebuttal. Just the weight of what it meant to sit behind that bench and realize in real time what it cost when judgment arrived, faster than fact. He reached for his gavel but paused. He didn't strike it. Not yet. We will comply, he said. This court acknowledges Ms. Ellison's federal status. All charges are formally dismissed. You are free to go. He paused again, then added quieter. We made an error in perception. Naomi stepped down from where she stood. She didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply walked toward Micah, who stood frozen in the hallway, eyes wide, hands clenched. Langston followed her at a respectful distance just behind, never in front. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't need to. His presence was comfort enough to everyone but the people who had misjudged her. Blake didn't say a word. He looked like he wanted to, like there was some apology trapped in his throat, but even he knew it wouldn't matter now. Jenna Marks didn't look away from Naomi. Not this time. She watched every step Naomi took. Watched the way the courtroom tilted back toward balance, not because someone shouted or threatened, but because one woman had the patience to let the truth speak louder than outrage. Naomi reached her brother. Micah looked like he wanted to say something, anything, but she simply touched his shoulder. Let's go, she said. He nodded, wiping his face. As she passed the clerk's desk, someone whispered, soft, unsure, "Who is she?" But no one answered. Langston paused at the door. He looked back just once, speaking not to the judge or the cops, but to the courtroom itself. Power doesn't always look like what you expect, but it always remembers who watched and who looked away. Then he followed Naomi out the door. And this time, when it closed behind them, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning. The doors hadn't yet stopped swinging before Judge Granger raised his hand. "Mr. Micah Ellison," he said, pausing to look up from the bench. "If you'd like to speak, we'll allow it. Informally." The room was quiet, but not cold. Not anymore. The kind of silence left after truth passes through when people aren't quite sure whether to apologize, applaud, or simply listen. Micah stepped forward, still in his court-ordered shirt, still shaking a little. But he didn't look small anymore. Not like the boy who once needed Naomi to carry him out of a juvenile center with blood on his lip and shame in his eyes. He didn't need a microphone. He didn't need a speech. My sister. He began, has never raised her voice to get attention. She didn't scream when she was overlooked for promotions. She didn't argue when they sent her into danger without explanation. She didn't even fight back when a cop twice her size twisted her arms in front of the courthouse she paid taxes to protect. He looked around, not accusing, not performing, just witnessing. She taught me to speak with my heart. He continued, his voice steady. But today, I'm borrowing her silence to say this. He paused. You failed her. The words weren't loud, but they landed like a verdict. A deeper one than any Judge Granger had ever read from his bench. Micah took one more step forward. Not just today, he said. You failed her every time you walked past someone like her and saw threat instead of strength. Every time you mistook stillness for danger. Every time you thought uniform meant protection, and forgot the ones wearing it could look like her. He turned his head briefly, locking eyes with Officer Jenna, whose expression was unreadable except for the faint press of her lips as if holding something back. And you know what's wild? He said, a sad smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. She knew this could happen. She knew. That's why she never told anyone what she really did. Because she knew some people don't respect what they can't define. Naomi hadn't moved. She stood just outside the courtroom door, now visible through the frosted pane, but she hadn't come back in. She didn't need to. She'd already said everything she came to say. With her presence. With her silence. Micah looked down for a second, collected himself. I love you, he whispered. Not into the mic, not toward the judge, just toward the door, to her. And for the first time since all this began, for the first time since her arms were yanked behind her back, since the crowd whispered. Since the badge fell, Naomi blinked back a tear. Just one. He stepped down. There was no applause, no stirring music, just a pause in time. One of those rare, unscripted human moments when everyone in the room forgets their role and just feels. Judge Granger adjusted his robe, quietly. He looked smaller now. Not disgraced, just grounded. Jenna Marks glanced at Blake, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His jaw was clenched, not in anger, but in something more complicated. Regret, maybe, or realization. Langston Reed remained outside, speaking into a secure line as the federal process began to turn. Not loud, not chaotic, just efficient. Clinical. The way real power moves, quiet, but unstoppable. Back in the room, Micah sat down again, not proud, not triumphant, just honest, the way his sister taught him to be. Because sometimes when the truth has been locked away too long, it doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs someone brave enough to let it fall from their mouth like a weight they've carried alone. And when it does, everyone feels it, even the ones who thought they were immune. It wasn't the kind of silence that settles. It was the kind that waits tense loaded like the sky holding back a storm. For a moment, everyone thought the worst had passed. Naomi had walked free. Micah had spoken. The courtroom had breathed again. But the system wasn't finished unraveling. Not yet. Because just as Langston Reed turned to leave the courthouse, his phone rang. Not a cell phone. Not something you swipe. A small encrypted black device, secure line direct from the department. He paused in the hallway, pressed the receiver to his ear and listened. His face didn't move, but something in his stance shifted. Then he nodded once and walked straight back into courtroom 3B, his steps faster now. Your Honor, he said, voice firmer than before by directive of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I am to inform this court of an immediate internal review involving Officer Blake Carson. A federal inquiry into unlawful arrest, misconduct, and civil rights violations is now active. The room froze. No whisper, no cough, just the soft clack of a pen falling from someone's hand. Blake's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. He glanced around as if someone might save him, Jenna maybe, or the judge, but no one moved. Langston continued. Effective immediately, Officer Carson is suspended from duty pending investigation. Blake's jaw locked. This is ridiculous, he muttered. Over a misunderstanding. A badge dropping out of a bag, but Langston didn't flinch. You arrested a federal officer without cause. You ignored protocol. You failed to verify identity, and you escalated without provocation. Naomi stood still at the back of the room, her arms crossed not in defiance but in patience. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply watched the weight shift back to where it belonged. Then Langston turned to Officer Jenna Marks. "You," he said with a nod. Followed training showed restraint and maintained composure. "The department acknowledges your conduct. A commendation will be issued through internal channels." Jenna blinked, surprised. Then she nodded once. No smile, no pride, just quiet professionalism. Judge Granger cleared his throat. "This court defers to the jurisdiction of federal review. Officer Carson is to surrender badge and sidearm." Bailiff. The bailiff, reluctant but obedient, stepped forward. Blake hesitated, still clinging to his belt. But in the end, he didn't resist. He unlatched the badge, placed it in the bailiff's hand, and turned toward the exit like someone waking from a dream he'd written himself into. As he passed Naomi, he avoided her eyes. He opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but she didn't give him the space to speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped forward. One last time. This time, not as a detainee, not as a defendant, but as a woman who had carried more than her share and decided it was time the system carried some of it too. She walked to the front of the courtroom and looked not at the judge, but at the people in the seats. The clerk. The reporters now flooding in after the story had already broken online. Layla's video had gone viral an hour ago, and the internet, unlike the court, wasted no time on deliberation. Then she spoke, quietly, calmly. "Justice isn't what saved me today," she said. "People who saw what justice forgot, they did." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look for applause. She just let the words sit in the air long enough for everyone to feel the burn behind them. Because she was right. It wasn't the badge that protected her. It wasn't the gavel or the law or the flag pinned above the courtroom door. It was Layla, a teenager who didn't stop filming. It was Jenna who didn't look away when her partner crossed a line. It was Micah who stood still when rage told him to run. It was people, the kind who remember that justice isn't just something printed on paper or spoken from a bench. It's something people live or suffer without. And today it lived. Naomi turned and walked out. This time not in silence, but under the full weight of her own name, spoken with dignity, remembered with honor, and no longer mistaken. The courtroom doors eased shut behind her, not with drama, but with a softness that somehow felt heavier than any gavel. Naomi Ellison stepped into the fading sunlight like a woman who had finally been unchained, not just from metal cuffs, but from years of quiet assumptions. She paused for just a breath. The late afternoon light reached across the steps, painting her face in amber. It wasn't the kind of light that demanded attention, it just found her like truth always does in the end. Micah followed close behind a step to her right, still holding the silence between them like something sacred. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every step they took was a word already spoken. They weren't walking away from something. They were walking through it. Just then, Layla appeared, small, unsure, but holding her phone like it was a torch in a dark place. She walked up slowly and said, "It's already at 2.3 million views." Naomi glanced down at the screen, saw herself frozen mid-frame, the handcuffs, the ID, the eyes that never looked away. She nodded gently, not surprised, not shaken, just steady. Then maybe she said quietly it didn't fall in vain. Layla held her gaze for a moment, as if trying to memorize what quiet strength looked like. Naomi gave her a small nod, not to dismiss her, but to pass something along. Not power, not thanks, just the sense that she'd been seen. Across the lawn, half-shadowed under the courthouse trees, stood an older white woman in a pale sweater. The same woman who had brushed past Naomi that morning, muttering judgment in a voice just loud enough to cut. But now, she said nothing. No apology, no excuse, just a nod. Small, hesitant, but different. This time it came with eyes that held the moment instead of looking past it. Naomi saw it. She didn't smile. She didn't nod back. She just looked for a second longer than she needed to, then turned away as if to say, "I'm done holding this weight for you." She and Micah stepped off the courthouse steps. There were no reporters, no applause, no officers shouting after them. Just the sound of footsteps on stone and the hush that follows when something big has happened and no one dares to speak first. Layla walked a few steps behind her phone, still in hand, still recording. But Naomi, She wasn't walking like someone who had won. She was walking like someone who had endured. Someone who didn't need to be heard anymore because the world was finally listening. And sometimes, that's the loudest sound there is. Some stories shout, others whisper. But the ones that stay with us are the ones that make us feel. Naomi's story wasn't just about an ID card. It was about the quiet strength of someone who chose not to raise her voice because her presence was the message. It was about justice being delayed but not denied. About how silence can be powerful when the truth stands behind it. If this story moved you even just for a moment, please take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories. We tell real human stories where pain meets courage and silence gives way to justice. Your support helps our creative team keep going, digging deeper, writing better, and bringing you more stories that don't just entertain, they mean something. And remember, at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell what happened. We remind you why it matters.